You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Hey everybody, Brian McClanahan here. We're back for the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 18, and it covers March 14th through 18th, 2016. Glad to be back. We've got a lot of good stuff to talk about. First and foremost, we've got an exciting event coming up in June. It's our 14th annual summer school, June 12th through 17th, 2016. The topic is the Southern Tradition and the Renewal of America. And I think this is a wonderful idea. It's to point out the positive elements of the South and what the South can offer to modern America today. So this is what the Abbeville Institute is all about, the Southern Tradition, exploring what's true and valuable in the Southern Tradition and how we can use it in our current lives. And so there's going to be a lot of great topics, a lot of great talks, very good faculty, including Clyde Wilson and Tom Fleming and Don Livingston, Bill Wilson, Jim Kibler, Kerry Roberts. So if you can, make plans to be at the 14th annual summer school. If you are a student, graduate student, undergraduate student in college, even advanced high school students, there are scholarships available. So contact Dr. Livingston. There is information on this on our website. Please consider going to our summer school. It should be a good time. We usually have pretty good attendance, so I think that you should make plans to attend if you can. Again, June 12th through 17th, 2016. Also, in that regard, if you cannot attend the summer school and you want to help support the Institute, please do so. We have links on our website on memberships for individuals. You can become a member for as little as $50 a year. That's less than $5 a month to help support our cause in exploring what is true and valuable in the Southern Tradition. All of the things that we do, whether it's the website, the events, the podcast, all of these things take money. So please help support us. Please help keep the lights on. Counterattacking attacks on the South, and the PC attack on the South is not free. It is fun, but it's not free. So please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute. All right. We had a very interesting week at the Abbeville Institute, and again, there wasn't a particular theme. When this week started, there was some discussion about making it a Calhoun week. That's what we did last year. And there were a couple of articles on Calhoun, but we also had a couple of other things that I think are very important for our discussion of the Southern Tradition. But it was the week of John C. Calhoun's birthday, and so the last piece of the week was in the Clyde Wilson Library. Usually do that on Wednesdays, but because Clyde Wilson is the greatest living scholar on John C. Calhoun, it was fitting that we had a Calhoun piece by Clyde Wilson on Friday, Calhoun's birthday, March 18th. So let's first start with our piece on Monday, which is a piece that was by Paul Gottfried, originally appeared at LouRockwell.com. And it's on a topic that we had written about before, but again, because it's the Calhoun week, I thought it'd be fun to put up a piece about the push to rename Calhoun College at Yale University. And Dr. Gottfried went to Yale, and so he is familiar with Calhoun College. In fact, apparently he resided there for a time. And he points out that this push to rename Calhoun College is just another example of this cultural Marxism that's sweeping the United States. It's just another example of the PC attack on the South, but in this case, it's taking place in the North because, of course, John C. Calhoun attended Yale University and then went to a law school very nearby, Litchfield Law School, which a lot of men at the time attended before Yale had its own law school. And he points out that, well, you know, perhaps if we're not going to use Calhoun, he comes up with some very funny names like Marion Barry. Maybe we should rename it Marion Barry College, or Obama College, or maybe Ellen Jane Willis, who was a Jewish feminist, abortion advocate, apostle of gay marriage. So perhaps they should pick some kind of leftist hero and put it on the college, and then everyone would know what Yale is all about. Of course, Calhoun, being one of the more famous men who attended Yale University, this is what's happening now. In Yale, you have even people who are important in American history. Calhoun wasn't just important in Southern history; he was important in American history. And at our conference in Charleston, the talk on Jefferson Davis by Bertram Hayes Davis was about that. Davis being an American icon, not just a Southern icon. In this particular case, Calhoun is an American icon, not just a Southern icon. He long maintained he was a Unionist throughout his life. And what he said is that the Union had to be equal, that you couldn't have a Union if one section or the other dominated the government. And so a Union had to benefit and burden all sections equally. Now, that's not often discussed because in modern society, we believe the Union is a union of people, not a union of states. And so there isn't this idea, well, we have to have a union that benefits and burdens all equally, or all states equally. But the question has to be asked, what are we a union of? And of course, if you look at the Constitution, it's expressly declared it's a union of states. If you just look at Article 7, it's a constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. Anyone who studies the Constitution knows this. But most Americans don't study the Constitution, so they're left with this nationalist myth that's pervasive in American education from elementary school all the way up through our law schools and graduate schools. I was reading a piece that was attacking something we had put on the website long ago, a couple of years ago, and it was about the 14th Amendment and how this nationalist myth, not just that, but this nationalist ideology and this nationalist position on the Constitution is so pervasive in graduate schools, and these people who are attacking this piece on the 14th Amendment were just saturated with it. And it's hard to argue with that position, or at least it's easy to argue with it, but it's hard to persuade someone who is so invested in that position that their position is wrong. And so this was an article singing the praises of the 14th Amendment, not really understanding that the 14th Amendment was never designed to be incorporated into the Bill of Rights was never designed to be incorporated into the states through the 14th Amendment. That was never even discussed, really. It was the Supreme Court that later did this. And so, but that's an aside. The point is that we have this myth of northern righteousness and southern demonization. And anyone who was important in the South for any particular reason, I mean, Calhoun, when he died, the eulogies from people like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay pointed out that Calhoun wasn't just a sectional man. He was one of the greatest Americans who had ever served in the United States Congress. But of course, because Calhoun had written and spoke about slavery, and you had people like Samuel Flagg Bemis calling him the defender of slavery. I mean, this is all he was. You have a position where Calhoun now is going to be demonized and downgraded all throughout the United States, even in the South. I mean, there's now a push to just eradicate Calhoun from society because he defended slavery. But there was so much more to Calhoun, and the last piece from Clyde Wilson will talk about that. So much more to Calhoun than that defense of slavery, which he is often pegged with. Calhoun is still, among the world, one of the most renowned political philosophers that America ever produced. People in the world don't have the same kind of distaste for one element of Calhoun's life like we have. And as I pointed out in Charleston, well, if we're going to eradicate every element of slavery, well, first of all, we need to rename Yale University because Yale was tied into the slave trade. So why don't we just start with renaming the entire university and just forget about Calhoun College? But there are so many people in the world who were advocates of slavery, but we think they're great men. And so this is fitting, for Calhoun. Sometimes I think the response should be, well, so what? We still admire Aristotle, who, if you read Politics, is a firm defense of slavery in Athenian society. We still admire Cicero, who owned slaves. We still admire George Washington, who owned slaves. Or you can even flip it on the north. We still admire Sam Adams and Benjamin Franklin, who dabbled in slavery and owned slaves. So what does this have to do? There are many great men in world history, Western civilization, the United States, that owned slaves or advocated slavery, but yet for most of these men, it's never discussed. But we pick out Southerners who defended the institution and forget about the many positive things that they had to say about politics and government and society. And we do that at our own peril. So the PC attack on the South and the PC attack on Calhoun is nothing more than an attempt, at its core, not to eradicate slavery from society, but to eradicate the position, the resistance to their status. It's because the South has long been the one obstacle to centralization in America. It's been the one obstacle to the leftist utopian egalitarian society that they want. It's been the one obstacle to political centralization, the Hamiltonian position, economic centralization, I should say. It has long been the roadblock. And in so many ways, it has always been the hub. And so if the South is America, which it is, and I mentioned the last podcast 17, that we should start using that phrase, the South is America, well then Calhoun becomes a real American. And so this is what we should remember about John C. Calhoun. And when you talk about John C. Calhoun, we should frame the debate and talk about all the things that he did for the United States, not just for the South. I mean, this man held every major position in the federal government except president. I mean, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Senator, Congressman, Vice President of the United States. So Calhoun was one of the more important Americans in American history, and it's unfortunate that people want to spend so much time demonizing a person like that. And we see this with many Southern figures, people that, because of their positions which are hideous to modern America on race or slavery, are just being erased when they still have valuable things to offer to society and valuable contributions to offer to our political discourse. And Calhoun is one of those people. So, if we're going to rename something in Yale, let's start with Yale University itself. Now, it's interesting, Yale, when I was doing some research for my talk in Charleston, Yale had actually put up a part on their website where they're talking about this now. Well, we have some skeletons in our closet. Most of the people that were early, Timothy Dwight, for example, most of the people that were early professors and great contributors to our university were slave traders or at least pro-slavery advocates. There wouldn't have been a pro-slavery defense, a religious pro-slavery defense in the South if it wasn't for the North. That's something that people like Larry Tice in his book Pro-Slavery emphasize quite heavily. The religious defense of slavery came out of the North. And so the North, slavery, as Don Livingston says, slavery is a national enormity. The North wasn't just complicit in it. It profited from it. It was behind it. Cotton was a major factor in the Northern economy. You wouldn't have had these Northern industrialists making as much money as they did without Southern cotton. So it was a national enormity. And we start from the position that slavery is a moral wrong, which it was, that slavery should have been eradicated, that even Southerners were saying this thing was foisted upon them by the British, and they didn't know what to do with it. They wanted to get rid of it. We take that position that it's morally wrong, then let's talk about slavery. But we also have to include the North in that conversation, and that's very uncomfortable for Northerners. So I think that going after Calhoun in this particular case is just another example of a misguided attack on the South when the discussion should be much larger than that. Okay, so speaking on that topic of slavery, the next piece we published this week was by James Rutledge Roche, and it is entitled Confederate Emancipation. And this is a talk that he gave in Alabama a couple of weeks ago. And it's on Confederate efforts to abolish slavery. And this is the unknown part of the war. Now, some people do talk about this, but they poo-poo it and say, oh, this is just too little too late. It's just it's disingenuous. Southerners really didn't mean this. But when you go through this particular piece, and it focuses a lot on Patrick Cleburne, who was the well-known Irish general it's often called the Stonewall of the West. And he put forward a proposal very early in the war to allow slaves their freedom if they would fight for the Confederacy. Now, in fairness, this proposal was shelved until about 1864, when it became apparent to Jefferson Davis that the war was taking a turn for the worse. They needed some other kind of infusion, manpower more than anything else, to try to win the war. And to Davis, independence was more important than anything else. He had made the statement even in 1861, we're fighting for independence, not for slavery. And so there were a variety of places that said this during the war. And so oftentimes you hear people say, well, this is just revisionism. This is just Southerners in 1865 after the war's over, in 1866, and the 1870s and 1880s, trying to revise what they were really fighting for. And if you go back and look at the secession ordinances, actually, if you look at the Declaration of Causes, because the ordinances don't mention secession, but if you look at the Declaration of Causes, in several states they mention slavery as the primary reason why they were upset about their status in the Union. But when you look at what people were saying during the war, and often cases they were actually refuting this position during the war itself. We're not fighting and dying for 300,000 slave owners, and actually James puts that very nice quote about that from a major newspaper in the South that said that. And Cleburne said this. Cleburne said, quote, "It is said slavery is all we are fighting for, and if we give it up, we give it up all. Even if this were true, which we deny, slavery is not all our enemies are fighting for. It is merely the pretense to establish sectional superiority and a more centralized form of government, and to deprive us of our rights and liberties. We have now briefly proposed a plan which we believe will save our country. It may be imperfect, but in all human probability it would give us our independence. No objection ought to outweigh it, which is not weightier than independence. If it is worthy of being put in practice, it ought to be mooted quickly before the people and urged earnestly by every man who believes in its efficiency." So Cleburne was saying, look, slavery is not all we're fighting for. Even if it's true, which it's not what the war is about. The war is about conquest and subjugation. Slavery was the mere pretext to get that. The North had long been agitating for a position of dominance in the government, and when they couldn't have it, as early as 1794, they wanted to secede from the Union themselves. This is the unanswerable position. If you start throwing this back and saying, okay, well, let's talk about this issue. And one of the positions that's often presented about the South is that the Southern government was illegitimate because there were slaves. Well, if that's the case, then the entire United States is illegitimate. Because in 1776, every state in the Union had slavery. And so then all of the state governments that were created by the American War for Independence are now all illegitimate governments. Now, of course, Massachusetts, through their Constitution, theoretically abolished slavery in 1780, but slavery continued to exist in that state, even after that. So, and of course, Massachusetts was profiting from the institution. Massachusetts slave traders were profiting from the institution, Rhode Island more than anyone else. But Massachusetts slave traders were definitely profiting from it. When they started building their textile mills, they were profiting from it, and they knew it. But here's Cleburne very clearly saying, this is not what we're fighting for. Now, of course, you had Southerners on the other side saying, well, we're not going to get rid of it. People like Robert Barnwell Rhett and others, we're not going to get rid of it. This is the basis of our society, whether it's for labor or our social society. This is the social basis of our society. But there were people who were looking at this and saying, okay, we'll get rid of slavery to gain independence. Jefferson Davis took this position. Robert E. Lee took this position. You can say it's too little too late. You can say it was disingenuous, but I don't think it was. I think these people generally desired independence more than anything else. And this is a very, very nice essay that goes through all of this, explains that, yes, there were people against emancipating slaves in the South. There were people who were saying that slavery is the core of our society. But there were others who had a much different position. And I love the fact that James brings up a couple of things. First of all, he talks about the Bruce Levine book, Confederate Emancipation, Southern Plans to Free and Arm Slaves During the Civil War. He says that Levine sneers at the half-hearted, feeble, and ultimately fruitless attempt to mimic and co-opt federal emancipation. Well, this just isn't true. It didn't mirror federal plans. And so he brings up Raimondo Luragi's book, The Rise and Fall of the Plantation South. Luragi has some very interesting things to say about Confederate emancipation. He says this: a comparison, as far as I know, of Davis's plan for emancipation and Lincoln's proclamation with the 13th Amendment has very rarely, if ever, been made. Lincoln's acts, important as they were, aimed to free a social class exploited by others than the group to which Lincoln belonged, whereas the Confederates were speaking of emancipating their own slaves and of hurting their own interests. Moreover, the 1862 proclamation had been expressly intended as a confiscation act of a sort. As a matter of fact, it did not apply to loyal or already submitted slave states. As far as the 13th Amendment is concerned, certainly Lincoln, had he lived, would have in some way compensated the South with Northern money. When he was assassinated, however, any project in this direction died with him. The South was abandoned to itself, and so were the blacks. The North did not want them. The Southern plan instead not only freed slave soldiers, but also granted them Southern citizenship and a homestead. Indeed, emancipation was not to be conducted in a capitalist way, freeing the slaves to create a wide mass of jobless, homeless persons ready to fill up the ranks of the Industrial Reserve Army, but in a limited and gradual way, even socially organized to help the integration of the new black yeoman class into the existing social order, helping the planters' civilization to survive, and who knows, even to be strengthened. This was certainly a rather conservative, surely not a revolutionary way to achieve emancipation, but neither was the Northern way revolutionary, as no ruling class can be expected to commit suicide by organizing a revolution against itself. The Southern way, however, would possibly have been more humane in comparison with the Northern. Certainly it would have been less demagogic and more solicitous, even of the fate of the blacks, by integrating them into the stable, harmonic society paternally ruled by the ruling class. James goes on to say, according to Luragi, Confederate emancipation was the swan song of the Old South. And he says Clyde Wilson describes it as perhaps the most selfless act ever performed by a ruling class which literally proposed to disinherit itself for national survival. And so, here we have this process by which we're talking about Confederate emancipation. He also brings up the Kenner Mission, which didn't bear fruit because the British refused to see Duncan Kenner and talk about emancipation. Kenner was there to say, look, if you'll recognize our independence, we will get rid of slavery. This happened. And of course, blacks were armed late in the war, 1865, to go fight. And this was a last-ditch effort by the Confederate government to do it. But it's often seen as, again, disingenuous. James also quotes Don Livingston, who says, this is Livingston's quote, "This failure does not take away from what we learned about the character of the Southern people, that they had the moral and political resources to effect emancipation when the right political circumstances presented themselves. It wasn't just too little too late. It was that they were willing to do it. I think that everyone should point out here. They were willing to do it for independence. But as this piece points out over and over again, it's not just about that. Independence was first and foremost on the mind of people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and Patrick Cleburne. This is why they were talking about it. And as newspapers pointed out, this is not a slaveholders' war. Most of the people who are fighting this war are not fighting for slavery. And the war has been turned on its head that way. I mean, it's talked about a war to end slavery, but everyone realized at the time it's not a war to end slavery. It's a war to subjugate the South. Slavery was a byproduct of the war. Ending slavery was a byproduct of the war, I should say, not the main goal of the war when the war began in 1861. All right, so it's a great piece. Take the time to read it. It's a long piece, almost 10,000 words, so take you a little while. On Wednesday, we had part 27 of Clyde Wilson's saying by our four Southerners. Some great things here. Of course, anytime you quote the outlaw Josie Wales, it's always a good day. There are some funny quotes, one by Ludwell Johnson, the late Ludwell Johnson, who said, Southern Republican is an oxymoron. Very true. He quotes himself, it is a plain fact that since Southern Democrats have been replaced by Republicans, conservatism has suffered severe decline in the Congress and the country. So these are always great quotes, and I recommend you go out and reading it. He has a quote from Calhoun. He says, quote, Calhoun says, quote, we act as if good institutions and liberty belong to us as of right, and that neither neglect nor folly can deprive us of their blessing, which is very true. All right, so on Thursday, we ran another piece in the Abbeville Review. Usually, we only do one piece in the review, but St. Patrick's Day, and I thought that we needed to have something about a Catholic Southerner. St. Patrick's Day being a Catholic holiday, in essence. So we have a nice example of a Catholic Southerner in Charles Carroll of Carrollton. And so this chapter was lifted from my Politically Incorrect Guide to the Founding Fathers. And the title is Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the Southern Irish Catholic Planter. And a lot of people don't know about Charles Carroll and who he was. Charles Carroll was one of the more important people in the founding generation. In fact, he was the last signer of the Declaration of Independence to die. He lived a very long time. His family came directly from Ireland. They were given, they ended up in Maryland because Maryland was a Catholic colony, and so the Calvert family had established it that way, and so the Carrolls ended up here. Charles Carroll, the settler, ended up here, and then that was Charles Carroll's grandfather. Charles Carroll of Carrollton's father was Charles Carroll of Annapolis. His father did not marry his mother until late, and it was because of the inheritance of their estate. Carroll's father was very stern, and Carroll was very insistent on his son's education. And so Carroll went to a Jesuit school and then was sent to Flanders to continue his education. But the interesting thing about Maryland by the time Carroll came of age is that Catholics cannot even vote in Maryland. The colony that was designed to be a Catholic colony, Catholics were disfranchised. And so Carroll couldn't vote, which makes his support for independence that much more interesting. Here is a man who cannot participate in Maryland politics, but who's pushing for independence. Now, of course, one of the byproducts of independence is that Carroll will get, again, the privilege of voting as a byproduct of the war. But he became one of the more vocal supporters of independence in Maryland. In fact, took part in all kinds of things, whether it was the opposition to the Stamp Act. And I mentioned in this, I say, how can a man who was barred from voting have such a vested interest in the rights of Englishmen? And I say simple. Carroll was the master of a 10,000-acre plantation and quite possibly the wealthiest man in the colonies. He was descended from the nobility, and his grandfather had been active in English politics for years before the Maryland government, hostile to his attachment to Lord Baltimore, revoked his right to vote. England was, after all, a Catholic country for much of its history. The barons who forced King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 were Catholic. Every monarch in the early modern era until Henry VIII, separated from the Catholic Church, was Catholic. There was a strong Catholic tradition in England, and the Carroll family was a prominent part of it. And though Irish by blood, he was an Englishman because he lived and prospered under the English Constitution. Carroll's hostility to the Stamp Act stemmed from a thorough understanding of the ancient rights of Englishmen, or what Patrick Henry called the ancient constitutions. Like any other leader of the American War for Independence, he ultimately believed that independence was the only way to ensure these rights. As early as 1764, Charles Carroll said the colonies must and will be independent. In 1764. A long time before we had the Declaration of Independence and these several states declaring their independence individually. That's also the unknown part of independence. Carroll, of course, signed the Declaration. He was there for its debate. And he was sent actually to Canada at one point to try to negotiate the separation of Canada from Great Britain. It didn't work out, but he did go because he was a Catholic, and of course there are a lot of French Canadians in Canada. After the war was over, he served in the United States Senate, was on the committee that hammered out the Bill of Rights. Carroll was a mild Federalist. He did believe in a strong central government, and he said that the Constitution was the perfect mix of, quote, the energy of monarchy, the wisdom of aristocracy, with the integrity, common interests, and spirit of a democracy. But he still said that the Union under the Constitution was a Confederated Republic. Maryland, as I said, was more his country than the United States. And one of the interesting things about Carroll, Doregan Manor is his plantation. It's still there. The chapel on the plantation was open to the public, but he had his own chapel. And, I mean, this was his country. Now, he had a terrible family life. His wife was addicted to opium. His son, Charles Carroll of Homewood, was an alcoholic. And Carroll had a very hard time because of his extended absences in maintaining his family life. And this is one thing when we talk about these men were willing to sacrifice their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, they meant it. And a lot of these men, it wasn't just, John Adams famously had family problems because of his activities in politics, and his family suffered. But many of the founding generation did. These men were sacrificing their family for this political cause. And that's a hard thing to do. And so Carroll was one of these people. Carroll was also an early abolitionist. Even though he owned 300 to 400 slaves at any given time, he presented a bill to the Maryland Senate for the gradual abolition of slavery. He said that all slave girls should be educated and then freed at 28, where they could educate their husbands and children. And again, so we talked about Confederate emancipation. This is one of the things that Southerners talked about quite often. Okay, so we say if we want to abolish slavery, how are we going to do it humanely, and how are these people going to be integrated into society? The way that abolition happened, people were being thrown to the wolves, and there was no integration into society. There was bitterness and resentment in all of this. Southerners were talking about how to best do this for years, but no plan ever found proper support in the South. So it wasn't because Southerners didn't try. It wasn't because there were people in the South who didn't try. And they were in the minority, of course, and that has to be recognized. They were in the minority. But there were Southerners who were willing to point this out. There's actually a very interesting book entitled The Other South by a man named Degler, and he talks about Southern abolitionists and how they were the minority, but there were a lot of them out there. Now, these are plans that people would say, well, I mean, they're just qualified emancipation plans. Well, they were. But even in the North, when some northern states were trying to put forward emancipation, they were following this kind of proposal. As the states were emancipating slavery, they were doing it gradually, over time. It wasn't just immediate emancipation. People had to be integrated into society if it was going to work. And I think that's one of the great travesties of Reconstruction is that people were not integrated into society. They weren't given the proper basis by which to be integrated into society. And those that were, you started seeing mass resentment for some things. And, unfortunately, you had the very violent time between whites and blacks in the South at various points after the war was over. But this discussion of how to best integrate Southern blacks into society was a conversation that Southerners were having all the way back in the 18th century. That's often the unknown part about Southern emancipation efforts. I concluded this particular essay with this paragraph. Alexis de Tocqueville called Carroll a European gentleman, and he was eulogized as the last of the Romans following his death in 1832. At 95, Carroll was the last remaining signer of the Declaration of Independence. He detested democracy, calling it nothing more than a mob, and hoped that the spirit of civil and religious liberty fostered by the War for Independence would continue long after the passing of the founding generation. Carroll personified the pious, conservative, agrarian American tradition, which came out of the South. He thought the government should be left in the hands of disinterested statesmen, men who accepted duty and did not seek power or emoluments and patronage the office provided. His vision was good, limited government, free from corruption and civil or religious persecution. Carroll was a Catholic Southern planter, the type of man, de Tocqueville said, provided America with her greatest spirits. This is true. I mean, Carol is, as a person, now there's a very good biography that came out after I wrote this by Brad Berzer. It's published by ISI, but it's a biography of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and it was in the Forgotten Founders biography series. So I'd recommend picking that up if you have a chance. It's good. That wasn't available when I wrote this. So last but not least, Calhoun's Carolina on Friday. So here we have John C. Calhoun's birthday, March 18th, and here we have a piece on John C. Calhoun. Now, Clyde points out that it was Calhoun was the proper pronunciation of Calhoun's name, but he was called Calhoun. And so he gets into the fact, he tells some very interesting stories. This piece was actually originally a talk before the John Randolph Club in 2005, held in Charleston, South Carolina. And it's not very long. It's that, Calhoun was buried in Charleston, even though the reason being behind that, his body had to be hidden from federal occupation. He probably would have preferred to be buried on his own property up in upstate South Carolina, which is Clemson University, if you're not aware. Some people don't know that, but Clemson University should be Calhoun University, but that was his son-in-law. One of the great things about this particular piece is that Clyde points out why Calhoun is important, not just for the South, but he's important for the United States. And not just that, he points out how important South Carolina was and how South Carolina is its own country in so many ways. And if you've ever lived in South Carolina, you realize that. The people there are different. They're very independent. They don't really care what other people think about them. And if you're not from South Carolina or spend a lot of time in South Carolina, you really are an outsider. Now, it doesn't mean they're not welcoming. They are. But it's a different kind of welcoming. You're still not a Carolinian. And so South Carolinians are very proud of their own history and their own status and their state. And again, they could care less if the Union follows what they do. They're going to do what they do, and that's fine to them. Now, some of this is going away. I mean, we've seen this with the governor of South Carolina capitulating recently to political pressure so she could get the response to the State of the Union address. I mean, this was a calculated political move on her part to just saddle up with the establishment of the Republican Party. That's all that was. But he talks about how important South Carolina was to Southern society and also American society, and how there were so many great intellectuals in South Carolina. And, Clyde Wilson is the greatest living, as I said in the beginning of this podcast, the greatest living scholar on John C. Calhoun. And people have asked him before, why don't you write a biography of Calhoun? And he says, I have. Just read all the introductions to all the editions of the Calhoun papers that I edited over all the years I was at South Carolina. And if you've never done this, if you've never gone out and looked at the introductions to all these, it's 27 volumes, I think, 28 volumes. If you've never done that, looked at all the volumes of that particular series and everything that Clyde wrote in the introductions, well, it's a treat. It really is. You're reading Clyde's biography of Calhoun one volume at a time. And so there's no need to write a biography. Now, it'd be great if you could put all that together. Of course, the University of South Carolina Press would have to allow someone to do that. But it'd be great if you could take all those introductions and put them together in a book and say, here is John C. Calhoun's biography. And so he concludes, the last couple of paragraphs are really interesting. He says, quote, I could talk about Calhoun for the rest of the year, but I am only allowed a few minutes. I could talk about his disquisition on government, which is a profound examination of human nature, society, government, constitutions as ever written by an American, and which rests in part on the experience of South Carolina in achieving consensus and freedom. I could talk about his understanding of Constitution and Union and efforts to preserve them in their original nature. But I will instead point to Calhoun's profound and prophetic statesmanship in less familiar matters, a prime exhibit of Republican virtue in which this country was founded and which has long disappeared. Calhoun saw it disappearing long before Lincoln killed it for good. What Calhoun's words tell us about many aspects of political economy, about questions of war and peace, about the nature and destiny of the American experiment, might persuade that he is the ideal Republican produced and upheld by the ideal republic that was South Carolina. And what he has to say is as relevant at this moment as it was when he spoke. So this is what the summer school is going to be about, that last statement. And Calhoun will be discussed at the summer school, and I think we're going to, at some point, have a conference on great Southern leaders and what they offer for society. Why we should pay attention to these people and what they still have to offer to modern America. I mean, that is the point. We're exploring what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition and its relation to modern America and what we can get out of it. So I'd recommend everyone to read this piece. It's very short. But also to think about that statement I made in the last podcast, and I've said it here again. The South is America. The South has always been America. And Southern statesmen have always been the ideal Americans. And so this PC attack on the South, this effort to reduce the South to that evil other, is doing so. The people that are doing this, well-meaning people. I mean, a lot of them are saying, "Well, I don't want to be. I want to try to get along and go along with these things because maybe people are offended by these things and they're upset about them." But what they're actually doing is reducing America in the process. We're recreating America. I mean, Barack Obama said this in 2009. A lot of people missed that. But he said very openly, we're going to continue the process of recreating America. And he's done that. And the last 8 years, the speed at which this is happening is much more enhanced than it has before. I mean, this has been going on. One thing I didn't mention, I received a whole bunch of material from Dr. Wilson and some books and some other things. But there was a copy of Southern Partisan magazine in that particular packet. And the cool thing about it, it was a copy of Southern Partisan magazine from 1982. And when you look at who was writing for this magazine, who was on the editorial board, in some ways, it makes you lament for the 80s, right? But the interesting thing about the 80s is people were aware in the 80s that there was an attack coming. And this is in some ways in a Southern cultural revival. You had the 70s where you had Southern music becoming very popular. You had the early 80s where you had shows like the Dukes of Hazzard on television. I mean, people were, the South was everywhere. You had Jimmy Carter elected president on this, this new Southerner kind of coming into office. But you look at the advisors and contributors to this particular magazine back in 1982. First of all, the editor was Tom Fleming, who became the editor of Chronicles magazine. The associate editor was Clyde Wilson. The Washington editor was Sam Francis. And then you had people like Mel Bradford and Lovewell Johnson, Russell Kirk, Andrew Lytle, James Merriweather, John Shelton Reed. Just some big names. Richard Hines, Rod Gregg. So people that, my gosh, if we could just have something like this today. And so you look back at the 1980s and you think, people were recognizing it then. What's happening? What's coming? And it's come to fruition. And the Southern Partisan in the 1980s was designed to try to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. The Abbeville Institute is doing that now in 2016. We've been doing it since 2002. We need your support. Think about a tax-deductible contribution. Think about attending our conferences and our summer schools. Share our material. Get educated on these things because it's the only way that we're going to hang on to anything that's left. And I tell people all the time, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So what needs to happen is that we just need to have the intellectual foundation to keep ourselves going. So, until next time, good day.